In World War I trenches, soldiers would walk on the bodies of their dead comrades to avoid sinking into the mud. These corpses became part of the trench structure itself. So, yeah, if these stories work for you, subscribe. And I'm curious, what time is it where you are? Comment below. Last week, someone from Canada said they listened during lunch breaks. Not judging, just wasn't expecting that. All right, World War I tonight. But wait, are you comfortable? No, really. Check. Pillows, blankets, the whole deal. Where we're going, you'll want to be settled. It's late 1916 on the Western Front. The air hangs heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else, something rotten. You're stirring awake on a narrow wooden platform built into the side of a muddy trench. Your back aches from sleeping upright against the dirt wall. The scratchy wool blanket wrapped around you offers little warmth against the November chill. Unlike your cozy bed right now, there's no pillow, just your helmet placed awkwardly behind your head. The worst part isn't even the discomfort. It's the constant, maddening itch. Lice. They're everywhere, breeding in the seams of your uniform, feasting on your skin. You've nicknamed them seam squirrels, a small joke to maintain sanity. Meet Albert Birdie Fletcher of Liverpool. Just 2 years ago, he was a 19-year-old shopkeeper with clean fingernails and pressed clothes. Now he's a battle-hardened soldier who hasn't had a proper bath in weeks, fighting in what they're calling the war to end all wars. Spoiler alert, it won't be. Stand to, comes the urgent whisper down the line. You grab your rifle instinctively, fingers finding the familiar wooden stock even before your eyes fully open. It's dawn, the most dangerous time. Both sides are most vulnerable to attack in these dim early hours, so everyone stands ready at the firing step, bayonets fixed, waiting. The waiting is almost worse than the fighting. I spent months researching soldiers' diaries from the King's Liverpool Regiment for this story. The one thing that kept jumping out at me was how ordinary these men were before the war. Take Birdie, for example. I mean, the guy sold ladies' hats for a living, for God's sake, had never even fired a gun. When war broke out in 1914, Britain erupted in patriotic fever. The government had posters everywhere with Lord Kitchener's stern face and pointing finger. Your country needs you. Recruiting offices were swamped with young men desperate to sign up before the whole thing was over. They were saying it would all be wrapped up by Christmas. Spoiler alert number 2. It wouldn't be. Birdie was caught up in the excitement, like everyone else. The morning after Britain declared war, he joined the flood of young men at the Liverpool recruiting office. Christ, will you look at this line? The man in front of him said, craning his neck to see the end of the queue that stretched around the block. Might as well have brought a bloody picnic. You're thinking, why would anyone volunteer for this? Well, imagine walking down the street and women are handing out white feathers to any young man not in uniform. A public shaming that marked you as a coward. Imagine your mates all signing up together, talking about adventure and glory, and the unemployment situation wasn't great either. 3 square meals and a steady wage didn't sound bad at all. After waiting for hours, Birdie finally made it inside. The recruitment officer barely looked up from his paperwork. Name? Albert Fletcher, sir. Age? 19, sir. Occupation? Shop clerk at Henderson's department store. Any preference on regiment? Bertie had briefly thought about joining the Royal Navy. His uncle had served and told exciting stories about foreign ports, but the idea of being stuck in a tin can bobbing along in the ocean didn't appeal to him. The King's Liverpool Regiment, if possible, sir. My father served with them in South Africa. The recruitment officer stamped some papers with practiced efficiency. Right. Medical examination is through that door. Next, the medical officer checks a batch of recruits in assembly line fashion. 20 men, all in their underwear, shuffling forward in a line. The doctor's face shows the exhaustion of having examined hundreds already today. Flat feet, hernias, lung troubles. The doctor barks at each man, hardly waiting for an answer before waving them on. He checks Bertie's height. A. 5'9". Good. Weight. Adequate. Teeth. Acceptable. Vision. Clear enough to shoot a German. Your hands are soft, boy, the doctor says, turning Bertie's palms up. They'll toughen up soon enough. The doctor's like, cough, as he cups Bertie's balls, and Bertie's thinking, is this really necessary? But he coughs anyway, because what else are you going to do? By afternoon, Bertie has signed up for 3 years or the duration of the war, whichever is longer. He's sworn his oath of loyalty to king and country, promising to obey all generals and officers over him. By evening, he's officially Private Albert Fletcher of the 17th Battalion, King's Liverpool Regiment, a unit that could trace its history back to the 17th century. Fast forward past the boring parts, the goodbyes to his parents. His mother cried. His father, a Boer War veteran, shook his hand firmly and told him to do his duty, packing his few belongings. The train journey to training camp. The first weeks of training were a shock to the system. Civilian habits had to be unlearned. Individuality was hammered out of them by drill sergeants whose vocabulary seemed limited to creative combinations of profanity. You call that marching? My grandmother moves faster, and she's been dead for 20 years. The sergeant bellows. Fletcher, pick up those knees. Training was designed to break you down and rebuild you as a soldier. The days began before dawn and ended after sunset. Marching, rifle drills, bayonet practice. More marching. Discipline was strict and unforgiving. And because the universe has a sense of humour, it's always raining. The training fields become mud baths. Everything is always damp. Your clothes, your blankets, even the letters you write home. This, it turns out, is excellent preparation for trench life. The real milestone is the day Bertie is issued his rifle, the short magazine Lee Enfield Mark III, or SMLE. It weighs almost 9 pounds, has a 25-inch barrel, and can hold 10 rounds in its magazine. The instructor handles his own rifle with a reverence that borders on love. This, he says, holding up his weapon, is not a rifle. This is your wife, your sweetheart, your best friend. You will clean her every day. You will know every inch of her. You will never let her out of your sight. Learning to shoot is a whole new education. The first time Birdie fires, the recoil nearly knocks him over. His shoulder bruises spectacularly, but by the end of training he can fire 15 aimed shots per minute, what they call the mad minute. The Germans, with their Mausers that only hold 5 rounds, will later mistake this rapid British fire for machine guns. Wait, it gets better. After the rifle comes bayonet training, which is somehow even more terrifying. They're practicing how to stab actual human beings, but they do it with disturbing enthusiasm. The bayonet is not for tickling, the instructor shouts. Put your weight behind it. Drive it in. Twist. Pull out. They practice on sandbags hanging from wooden frames. Each bag has a crude German helmet painted on it. Imagine he's just killed your best mate. The instructor suggests helpfully. Imagine he's about to bayonet a wounded British soldier. I've read accounts where soldiers said the bayonet training was the most disturbing part of their preparation. It made the killing personal in a way that firing a rifle at distant figures didn't. The drill instructor gets in Birdie's face. You think the Germans will wait while you figure out how to use that bayonet. Honestly, Birdie kind of wishes they would. Cut to Birdie, sore, in places he didn't know could be sore, lying on his bunk in the barracks. The men around him are no longer strangers. They've become his second family through the shared misery of training. There's Williams, a coal miner with forearms like tree trunks. Cooper, a former accountant who still tries to keep his boots polished to an impossible shine. Jenkins, barely 18, who writes to his mother every single night. These men will form the core of Birdie's new world. They learn each other's stories, share packages from home, cover for each other when one of them needs a moment of peace. They don't know it yet, but these bonds will be tested in ways they can't imagine in the mud and blood of France. Speaking of France, rumours are flying that they'll be shipping out soon. The battalion is almost ready. Equipment inspections become more frequent and thorough. New uniforms are issued. Lectures about the trenches begin, but nothing that really prepares them for what's coming. At night, Birdie sometimes lies awake, listening to the sounds of the barracks, the snoring, the occasional muffled sob, the whispered conversations. He tries to remember the details of his old life, the feel of clean sheets, the smell of his mother's cooking, the rhythm of ordinary days at the shop. Those memories are already starting to feel distant, like they belonged to someone else. In the morning, they're awakened before dawn for yet another route march with full packs. 60 pounds of gear strapped to their backs, rifles over shoulders, 10 miles before breakfast. Their feet are blistered, shoulders raw, but no one complains. This isn't even the hard part yet. The training intensifies as their departure date approaches. Gas mask drills where they practice donning the masks in seconds. Trench construction lessons where they learn to dig and shore up earthworks. Sessions on trench hygiene and how to avoid trench foot, a condition they'll become all too familiar with. Then, one evening, the captain gathers them all. "Tomorrow," he says, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent yard, "we depart for Southampton. From there, we cross to France. You have trained well. You are ready." No one sleeps much that night. Some write final letters home, Others clean their equipment obsessively. A few sneak off to find alcohol or women. Last comforts before the unknown. Birdie lies on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, wondering what awaits him across the channel, unaware that the next 2 years will transform him completely. He doesn't know about the mud that will become his world, the rats as big as cats, the lice that will be his constant companions, or the sounds of shells that will haunt his dreams forever. He doesn't know that he'll celebrate his 21st birthday in a flooded dugout, sharing a tin of bully beef with the remains of his section after a German artillery barrage. Right now, he's still partly the shop clerk, not fully the soldier he'll become. Tomorrow they cross to France. Tomorrow the real war begins. The Channel crossing was hell, not because of German U-boats, but because Birdie discovered he got violently seasick. Nothing quite humbles you like puking your guts out in front of your entire battalion. Never seen someone turn that shade of green before. Williams laughed, slapping Birdie's back as he hung over the railing. Like a bloody chameleon, you are. 24 hours earlier, they'd marched through Southampton with bands playing and crowds cheering. Women handed out flowers and cigarettes. Children waved little Union Jacks. Old men stood at attention, veterans of older wars saluting the new generation heading off to fight. The mood was electric, part carnival, part funeral procession. But now, hunched over the side of the transport ship, with the taste of bile in his mouth and the cold spray of the Channel on his face, the romance of war seemed very far away. The crossing took just hours but felt like days. France didn't look like much when they first arrived at the port of Le Havre. Just another busy harbour town, though with more soldiers than civilians visible on the streets. They weren't sent immediately to the front, thank God. Instead, they were marched to a transit camp outside the town, a sprawling collection of bell tents set up in muddy fields. The veterans already called it the Bull Ring, the place where fresh troops from England were given their final training before being sent up the line. The instructors here weren't the drill sergeants from basic training. These were men who'd been at the front. Some missing limbs, others with the 1,000-yard stare that Birdie would soon become familiar with. Forget half of what they taught you back home, a lieutenant with a patch over one eye told them on their first morning. I'm going to teach you what keeps you alive. The training was different here, more practical, more urgent. They practiced with gas masks until they could put them on in under 6 seconds. They rehearsed trench raids using actual trench systems dug into the French countryside. They learned how to use Mills bombs, grenades with a distinctive pineapple pattern that could blow a man to pieces. Each night, Birdie could hear the distant rumble of artillery from the front. It sounded like far-off thunder, but continuous, never-ending. The veterans called it drumfire, the sound of hundreds of guns firing day and night. Even from miles away, it made the ground tremble slightly beneath their tents. "That's the Somme offensive," an older soldier told him. "Been going since July. Bloody meat grinder, it is." You know how war movies always have that scene where the new guy meets the battle-hardened sergeant who's seen it all? Yeah, this was that moment for Birdie. The sergeant's name was Holloway, and his uniform had clearly seen better days. There was a healed gash across his cheek that pulled his mouth into a permanent half-smirk. "Listen up, you fresh-faced bastards," he said, eyeing the new replacements. "The Hun's been sitting in those trenches for 2 years now. He knows every inch of ground between his line and ours. He's got it ranged with his artillery and his machine guns, so when I tell you to keep your head down, you bloody well keep it down." For a week, they trained harder than they ever had before. They learned the peculiar skills of trench warfare, how to move silently, how to kill silently, how to live in mud and filth without getting sick. They practiced with the SMLE rifle again, but this time with bayonet attached, stabbing sandbags with human outlines painted on them. The food was still decent this far back. Fresh bread sometimes, hot stew most evenings, tea that actually tasted like tea. Birdie knew from the veterans' stories that this wouldn't last. "Up the line, it's bully beef and biscuits," Jenkins said through a mouthful of stew. He'd been talking to one of the old-timers. "Bloke told me the biscuits are so hard. They use 'em to repair the trenches when they run out of wood." But the real eye-opener came when the wounded started arriving from the front. The camp was close enough to the rear areas that they sometimes received casualties being transported back to the coast. Seeing actual wounded, not training exercises or medical lectures, hit different. The walking wounded came first. Men with bandaged heads, arms in slings, limping on crutches. They looked tired, dirty, but they could still smile, still joke with the fresh troops. But then came the stretcher cases. "Make way! Make way!" orderlies shouted, carrying stretchers to waiting ambulances. Birdie saw things he couldn't unsee. A man with half his face gone. Another with stumps where his legs should be. One soldier couldn't have been more than 20, thrashing on his stretcher, eyes wild with terror, screaming about rats eating his feet. "Shell shock," Holloway said quietly, appearing at Birdie's side. "Mind breaks. Seen it before. Poor bugger." That night, Birdie wrote home, but found he couldn't describe what he'd seen, so he wrote about the French countryside instead, the peculiar food, the funny way the locals spoke. He didn't mention the wounded. He didn't mention the constant thunder of guns, and he certainly didn't mention his growing fear. On their 8th day in France, orders came down. They were moving up to the front. The battalion assembled before dawn, full kit, weapons cleaned and inspected. The sky was just starting to lighten in the east when they set off, hundreds of men marching in columns along dusty French roads. As they moved, the landscape began to change. The neat farms and villages gave way to a world increasingly damaged by war. First, just military encampments and supply dumps dotting the fields, then damaged buildings, a church with its steeple gone, farmhouses with holes in their roofs. Further on, entire villages reduced to rubble, trees stripped of branches and leaves, standing like skeletal fingers pointing at the sky, fields churned into mud, crisscrossed with wheel tracks from artillery pieces and supply wagons. The sounds changed too. The distant thunder grew louder with each mile, becoming distinct booms and crashes. They could now tell the difference between their own guns firing and the German shells landing. New sounds joined the chorus: the crack of rifle fire, the ripping canvas sound of machine guns, the whine and whistle of shells passing overhead. They passed a battery of 18-pounders firing from a muddy field. The gunners, stripped to the waist despite the November chill, were black with powder residue. The guns fired with a sound that Birdie felt in his chest, the blast wave hitting him like a punch. "Keeps the botches. I'll head down while we relieve the line," a gunner shouted cheerfully as they marched past. By afternoon, they were in what the officers called the communication zone, the area a few miles behind the actual front line. Here, the war had transformed everything. No building stood undamaged. The roads were choked with military traffic, supply wagons, ammunition limbers, ambulances heading in the opposite direction, their red crosses splattered with mud. "This was a town once," Cooper said, gesturing to a landscape of broken brick and timber that they marched through. "Can't even tell what's a street and what's a building anymore. The air smelled different here, a mix of cordite, smoke, decay, and something else, something Birdie couldn't identify yet, but would soon come to know intimately. The smell of thousands of men living in trenches without proper sanitation. They stopped for the night at a support camp, the last proper rest they would get before entering the trench system. Tents were set up in the ruins of what might have been an orchard. A field kitchen had been established, and they lined up with their mess tins for what the cook called the condemned man's last meal, a better-than-average stew with actual chunks of meat and vegetables, and tea so strong it practically chewed itself. Holloway found Birdie sitting against the stump of a blasted tree, carefully cleaning his rifle for the 10th time that day. "Get some sleep," he said, not unkindly. "Tomorrow's going to be a long one." But sleep didn't come easy with the constant artillery fire and the knowledge of what awaited them. Birdie lay in his tent, listening to Cooper's soft snoring and Jenkins' occasional whimpers. Around midnight, a flight of German planes passed overhead, headed for targets behind the lines. The anti-aircraft guns opened up, their shells bursting in the sky with sharp cracks. Dawn came grey and sullen, with a light drizzle that seemed to get inside everything. After a breakfast of tea and hard biscuits, they formed up again. The final approach to the front would be made in smaller groups, moving through communication trenches rather than on open roads, where they'd be visible to German observers. Their platoon was led by a fresh-faced lieutenant named Wilkins, who looked barely old enough to shave. Holloway seemed to have adopted their group, saying they needed the most looking after. "Right, you lot," he said as they prepared to move out. "From here on, we're in range of their guns. Keep your spacing, keep low when I tell you, and for God's sake, don't bunch up if the shelling starts." The communication trenches were like a maze cut into the earth, 7 feet deep, about 3 feet wide, zigzagging back toward the front line. The walls were shored up with wooden planks in some places, sandbags in others. The bottom had wooden duckboards to walk on, but in many spots these were broken or missing, leaving them to wade through ankle-deep mud. "Mind the rats!" Holloway called back. "Nasty little bastards will bite if you corner them." Sure enough, as they rounded a bend in the trench, a rat the size of a small cat scurried across the duckboards ahead of them. Jenkins let out a startled yelp. "Jesus! I thought that was a dog!" he exclaimed. "Nah, dogs are rare up here," Williams said with a grin. "Good eating on a dog. Rats, though, plenty of those." As they moved closer to the front, the communication trench grew more crowded. They passed stretcher bearers carrying wounded to the rear, ration parties heading up with supplies, work details carrying timber and sandbags. Everyone looked tired, mud-caked, eyes hollow, and then they heard it. A strange whooshing sound that quickly grew to a terrifying screech. "Down!" Holloway bellowed, pressing himself against the trench wall. Birdie barely had time to react before the world seemed to explode. The shell landed just outside the trench, showering them with dirt and debris. His ears rang, and for a moment he couldn't hear anything but a high-pitched whine. "Everyone all right?" Wilkins called out, his voice sounding distant and muffled through the ringing in Birdie's ears. Miraculously, no one was hit, but the near miss had rattled them all. Birdie found his hands shaking as he brushed dirt from his uniform. The taste of fear was metallic in his mouth. "Random shelling," Holloway explained, once they started moving again. "They do it all day long, trying to catch ration parties or reinforcements. You'll get used to it." Birdie wasn't sure he wanted to get used to something like that. The final approach to the front-line trench was the worst. The communication trench here was shallower, more damaged by shellfire. In places, they had to crouch low to avoid exposing themselves above the parapet. The ground vibrated constantly from the guns, firing just behind the line, and the German shells landing just ahead. When they finally reached the support trench, the second line behind the actual front, they found a scene of organized chaos. Men were sleeping in dugouts carved into the trench walls. Others stood on the fire step, rifles ready. Runners moved up and down the line carrying messages. A stretcher party pushed past them, carrying a man with a bloody bandage around his head. "King's Liverpool, eh?" A tired-looking corporal said, noticing their shoulder patches. "You're relieving B Company. They've had a rough week." Their guide led them through the tangled network of trenches, support lines, reserve trenches, communication trenches that connected everything in a bewildering maze. Birdie tried to memorize the layout, but soon gave up. It was like being in a city built into the ground, with main streets and alleys and dead ends, all looking depressingly similar, and everywhere there was mud. Not the clean country mud of England, but a glutinous, sticky clay that clung to their boots and puttees, making each step an effort. In low spots, the mud was knee-deep, threatening to suck the boots right off their feet. The smell hit next. A combination of unwashed bodies, latrine trenches, rotting sandbags, and something worse that Birdie didn't want to identify but suspected was decomposing flesh. The veterans didn't seem to notice anymore. "Right through here," their guide said, pointing to a narrow connecting trench. "Front lines just ahead. Keep your heads down when you cross the traverse. Jerry's got a sniper who likes that section." The front line trench was both better and worse than Birdie had imagined. Better in that it was deeper and more solidly built than the communication trenches, with proper dugouts and firing positions. Worse in that it was clearly a place where men had been living fighting and dying for months. The walls were studded with small personal items, pictures from home tacked up, improvised shelves holding tobacco tins and candle stubs, crude graffiti carved into support beams. The floor was scattered with spent cartridge cases, empty tins, cigarette butts, all slowly sinking into the omnipresent mud. And just over the parapet, close enough to shout to, though no one did, through a periscope mounted at a firing position, Birdie got his first glimpse of no man's land, a hellscape of shell holes, tangled barbed wire, and broken ground that separated the opposing trenches. "Home sweet home," Holloway said, dropping his pack in a small dugout carved into the forward wall of the trench. "Get settled in, lads. We're here for the duration." The men they were relieving looked like ghosts, pale, hollow-eyed, moving with the slow care of extreme exhaustion. They barely spoke as they gathered their gear, just nodded at the newcomers with expressions that mixed relief and pity. One sergeant, grey stubble covering his cheeks, paused by Birdie. "First time in the line?" he asked. Birdie nodded. "Keep your head down, change your socks when you can, and don't let the rats bother you too much." He hesitated, then added, "And write your letters home now. Never know when you'll get another chance." With that cheerful advice, the old company filed out toward the rear, leaving Birdie and his mates to take their places along the firing line. Lieutenant Wilkins set up a rotation, 2 hours on sentry duty, 4 hours rest, with everyone standing to at dawn and dusk, when attacks were most likely. Birdie drew the first sentry shift. As the others settled into the dugouts, he took his position at a firing step, peering through a small loophole at the broken landscape of no man's land. A light rain began to fall, pattering on his helmet. From somewhere to his right, a machine gun opened up, its distinctive rapid fire echoing along the line. A flare shot up from the German trenches, casting an eerie light over the battlefield before sputtering out. Otherwise, an unexpected, unnerving quiet had fallen, broken only by occasional rifle shots and the more distant thunder of artillery. And so began Birdie Fletcher's life in the trenches of the Western Front. The shop clerk from Liverpool had completed his journey from civilian to soldier. His real war was just beginning. Birdie's first proper morning in the trench began with a kick to his ribs. "Up! Stand to! Move your arse!" It was Holloway, already fully awake, despite the ungodly hour. Outside the dugout, the sky was just beginning to lighten. That dangerous time before dawn, when attacks were most likely. Birdie grabbed his rifle and scrambled up from the wooden platform that passed for a bed, his muscles stiff from cold and awkward sleep. The entire line was coming awake. Men taking positions along the fire step, rifles at the ready, bayonets fixed. Everyone stared out into the murky half-light of no man's land, searching for any sign of movement, any hint that the Germans might be coming. "This happens every morning?" Birdie whispered to Cooper, who had taken position next to him. "Twice a day. Dawn and dusk. Most likely times for an attack," Cooper replied, eyes never leaving his firing slit. Fritz does the same thing on his side. It was the strangest standoff Birdie had ever experienced. Two armies, separated by just a couple hundred yards of blasted earth, both waiting for the other to make a move, both ready to unleash hell if they did. But this morning, like most mornings, nothing happened. As the light grew stronger, tension eased slightly. Men still kept watch, but others moved away from the fire step, lighting cigarettes, stamping feet to get blood flowing. "Right, you lot," Lieutenant Wilkins called out. "Rum ration and breakfast." Then inspection. The rum came in large earthenware jugs marked S.R.D. Officially, Service Rations Depot. But the men joked it meant seldom reaches destination, because officers had a habit of keeping the good stuff for themselves. A corporal measured it out in enamel mugs, just a splash. But the harsh burn was welcome in the damp morning chill. The so-called breakfast arrived next. Lukewarm tea in the same mugs and rock-hard biscuits that could chip a tooth if you weren't careful. Some men had tins of bully beef saved from yesterday's rations. The greasy meat spread on biscuits softened in tea. "This tastes like shit," Jenkins complained, chewing gingerly on a biscuit. "Give it a week." A veteran named Parker replied, "You'll be dreaming about these feasts when we're on half rations after a barrage cuts the supply line." After breakfast came weapon inspection. Lieutenant Wilkins and Sergeant Holloway moved down the line, checking each rifle. Dirt in the wrong places could cause a jam, and a jammed rifle was worse than useless when lives depended on it. Barrels filthy. Fletcher, Holloway growled, peering down the business end of Birdie's SMLE. "Clean it proper, or you'll be digging latrine trenches for a week." The morning routine established, Birdie soon learned the rhythm of trench life. With stand to over, the day's work began. Every man had duties, essential tasks that kept the trench functioning, and more importantly, kept it from collapsing or flooding. Fletcher, Cooper, Jenkins, drainage detail. Holloway barked, assigning the new arrivals the least desirable job. The trenches were constantly fighting a battle against water. Rain, groundwater, and sometimes broken pipes meant the bottom of the trench was often a muddy soup. Drainage involved clearing the small channels cut into the trench floor and emptying the sumps. Deeper holes dug at intervals to collect water. It was back-breaking work, scooping out mud with entrenching tools, filling sandbags with the worst of it. Within an hour, Birdie was soaked to the knees, his hands raw and bleeding from the rough wood of the tool handle. "Better get used to it," Parker told him cheerfully, passing by with an armload of timber for a dugout repair. "When it really rains, we'll be bailing like sailors in a storm." By midday, Birdie had learned more trench vocabulary than he ever wanted to know. The fire step, the parapet, the parados, traverses, dugouts, saps, listening posts. Each part of the trench had a name and a purpose, all designed to provide maximum protection with minimum exposure. For lunch, or dinner, as they called the midday meal, they had more bully beef, this time heated in mess tins over small spirit stoves. It was marginally better warm, though the fatty meat still stuck to the roof of Birdie's mouth in an unpleasant way. "Got any bread?" Williams asked hopefully, looking at the new arrivals. "Fresh out," Cooper replied. "Just these concrete biscuits." "Save 'em," advised Parker. "Never know when they'll come in handy. I've used 'em as shims to level wobbly duckboards before." After the meal came more work, endless work, repairing damaged sections of the trench wall, replacing rotted duckboards, filling sandbags, improving drainage. The trenches were in constant need of maintenance, a never-ending battle against the elements and enemy shells. "Why's it zigzag like this?" Jenkins asked, as they worked on reinforcing a section of the trench wall with fresh sandbags. "So, one shell can't take out the whole line," Williams explained. "And if Fritz gets in, he can't shoot straight down the trench. Each bend is a defensive position." It made sense, but it made navigation a nightmare. The front line connected to support and reserve trenches behind it, with communication trenches running back to the rear areas. The whole system was like an underground maze, and getting lost was a genuine concern for newcomers. Mid-afternoon brought Birdie's first experience with real shelling. It started with a distant crump, German guns firing miles behind their lines. Then came the eerie whistle of shells passing overhead. "Incoming!" someone shouted from further down the line. Everyone pressed themselves against the trench walls or dove into the nearest dugout. The first shell landed about 50 yards behind their position, with a thunderous crash that sent dirt raining down on them. More followed in quick succession, walking closer to their trench. "Just ranging fire," Holloway said, crouched next to Birdie in a shallow dugout. "They do this a couple times a day. Keeps us on our toes." Birdie's heart hammered in his chest as the shells crept closer, each explosion a physical shock that rattled his bones. The noise was overwhelming, not just loud, but all-encompassing, pressing against his ears until he thought his head might burst. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed seemed almost as shocking as the bombardment. "They're saving the rest for tonight," Holloway said, dusting himself off. "Back to work, lads." The afternoon dragged into evening. As the light began to fade, the order came down. "Stand to." Once again, the entire line manned. The fire step. Watching the gathering darkness for any sign of attack. Once again, none came. With full night settling in, the real work began. Under cover of darkness, when movement was less likely to be spotted by snipers or draw artillery fire, special duties were performed. Working parties went out to repair the barbed wire in front of their position. Others carried up supplies from the rear. Food, water, ammunition, letters from home. Birdie was assigned to a ration party, trudging back through the communication trenches to a supply dump in the support line. The darkness was almost complete, broken only by occasional flares that cast eerie, shifting shadows across the landscape. "Keep your head down when the flares go up," hissed Williams, who was leading their small group. "Freeze completely. Movement catches their eye." Sure enough, as they made their way back, with crates of tinned food and containers of water, a flare shot up from the German lines, bathing everything in harsh white light. Birdie froze mid-step, heart pounding, the weight of the water digging into his shoulder. The lights seemed to hang forever before finally sputtering out, allowing them to move again. Back in their section, Birdie discovered another aspect of trench life, the ever-present wildlife. Rats were everywhere, grown fat on the detritus of war, and the unburied dead in no man's land. They scurried along the trench bottom, nested in dugouts, boldly raided food stores. "Jesus!" Jenkins yelped, jumping back as a particularly large specimen ran across his boots. "That thing's the size of a bloody terrier." "That's just Harold," Parker said with a grin. "He's been here longer than most of us. Some of the lads feed him on purpose. Better to have him as a friend than an enemy. He'll go for your toes otherwise while you're sleeping." It wasn't just rats. Lice infested everyone's clothing within days of arriving at the front. They lived in the seams of uniforms, laying eggs that hatched with body heat. The itching was maddening. "Only way to get rid of 'em is to run a candle along the seams," Parker demonstrated, carefully passing a lit candle along the inside seam of his tunic. "Hear that? The little pops? That's them buggers frying." It helped, but never eliminated the problem completely. Men spent idle moments chatting, crushing lice between thumbnails with an audible click, a social activity as much as a hygienic one. That first night, Birdie was assigned the midnight watch, 2 hours on the fire step, peering into darkness, listening for any sound from the German lines. The night was eerily quiet, broken only by occasional rifle shots and the distant rumble of artillery further down the line. The stars were beautiful, he noticed, a strange thought in such a place. With no electric lights for miles, the sky was alive with them in a way he'd never seen in Liverpool. His contemplation was interrupted by movement in no man's land. Just a shadow shifting against the darkness. He raised his rifle, finger hovering near the trigger. "Probably just a rat," whispered Parker, who was on watch beside him. "Big as dogs out there. Feeding on, well, you know." Birdie did know, and tried not to think about it. The thought of rats feeding on the dead made his stomach turn. There were bodies out there that couldn't be recovered, men who had fallen in attacks or raids, now slowly returning to the mud. The shadow moved again, more deliberately this time. "Patrol," Parker hissed. "Ours or theirs? Can't tell." Birdie's finger tightened on the trigger. If it was Germans. "Hold fire," came a whispered command from further down the line. "It's Middlesex boys coming back in. They've been out all night on a listening patrol." Sure enough, a few minutes later, a small group of mud-covered soldiers dropped into the trench through a gap in the wire, looking exhausted but relieved to be back behind their own lines. When his watch ended, Birdie crawled into the dugout assigned to him and 5 others, a cramped space with wooden bunks built into the walls. Sleep came in broken fragments, disrupted by the occasional shell, the scurrying of rats, and the coughing of men around him. The days began to blur together. Each morning the same routine. Stand to at dawn. Rum ration. Breakfast. Inspection. Each day filled with the same tasks. Repairing. Reinforcing. Draining. Cleaning. Each night the same tension. darkness bringing both danger and relative safety from observation. On his third day, they received mail from home. A runner brought a sack of letters up from the rear, a precious connection to the world outside the trenches. Birdie received 2 to 1 from his mother, full of cheerful news about neighbours and questions about whether he was eating enough. Another from his father, shorter and more restrained, asking practical questions about his equipment and offering advice on staying dry. He read them by the light of a candle stub in the dugout, the pages already smudged with mud from handling. They seemed to come from another universe, one where people worried about the price of bread, or whether Mrs. Collins next door was really going to sell her piano. It made the war seem both more and less real. Somehow. "Bad news?" Cooper asked, noticing Birdie's expression. "No, just strange. My mum's talking about the church bazaar while we're sitting in a muddy hole waiting for someone to shell us." Cooper nodded. "My girl keeps asking when I'll be home. Like I bloody know." "That night," Birdie wrote back, struggling to find things to say that wouldn't worry them and wouldn't get censored by the officers who read all outgoing mail. He ended up writing about the food, bad but edible, the weather, cold but manageable, and made up a story about winning cigarettes in a card game he hadn't played, but it sounded normal. He didn't mention the rats, or the lice, or the smell of death that hung over everything. He didn't tell them about the shells that fell randomly throughout the day, or how he pressed himself against the trench wall each time, praying the next one wouldn't have his name on it. He didn't describe the way fear had become his constant companion, a cold knot in his stomach that never quite went away. On the 4th day, they suffered their first casualty. A sniper got Johnson, a quiet man from Birkenhead who had shared his cigarettes with Birdie the night before. One moment, Johnson was adjusting his equipment, standing just a fraction too high on the fire step. The next, he was crumpling to the ground with a neat hole in his forehead, eyes wide with surprise. The stretcher-bearers came quickly, sliding his body onto canvas and carrying him to the aid post in the support trench, though everyone knew he was already gone. His blood soaked into the duckboards, adding to the dark stains already there from previous casualties. That night, Birdie couldn't sleep. He kept seeing Johnson's face, not the slack, empty expression after death, but the living man who had talked about his plans to open a tobacconist shop after the war. First one's always the worst, Holloway told him. Finding him sitting alone at the small fire, they kept going for warmth and tea. Don't get easier, exactly, but you learn to carry it. Birdie wasn't sure he wanted to learn that particular skill. On the 5th day, a work party from the Royal Engineers arrived to improve their section of the line. They brought timber, corrugated iron, and actual tools instead of the entrenching implements the infantry carried. "Turning this place into a bloody palace," one of the engineers joked as they set about shoring up dugouts and improving drainage. The improvements were welcome. Better dugouts meant drier sleeping quarters. Deeper drainage channels meant less standing water. Stronger revetments meant less risk of the trench walls collapsing during shelling. While they worked, Birdie learned more about the overall situation. Their section of the line was relatively quiet, what veterans called a nursery sector. where new units were broken in before being sent to more active areas. "Count yourselves lucky," an older engineer told them. "Up north at Ypres, they're in water up to their waists. Down south on the Somme, they've been hammering each other for months. This is a holiday camp by comparison." Holiday camp or not, Birdie found it hard to imagine a worse place. Everything was perpetually damp. The mud got into everything: food, equipment, clothing, hair. The smell was an unholy combination of unwashed bodies, latrine trenches, cordite from weapons, and decomposing matter of all kinds. And always there was the waiting. Long stretches of boredom punctuated by moments of terror. When shells fell or a machine gun opened up, the Germans were there, just across the blasted landscape of no man's land, living much the same existence, but unseen except as shadows or movement glimpsed through periscopes. By the end of the first week, Birdie had changed in ways he couldn't quite articulate. His hands had hardened, growing calluses from endless digging and lifting. His face was thinner, with a perpetual stubble he didn't bother to shave. His uniform, once new and well-fitting, was now stained with mud, sweat, and blood that wasn't his own. More than the physical changes, though, were the ones inside. He'd learned to sleep in snatches whenever possible. He'd developed a sixth sense for incoming shells, diving for cover seconds before the whistle became audible to others. He'd stopped jumping at rifle shots. He'd gotten used to the rats. One evening, as they sat around a small fire heating tea, Parker studied him thoughtfully. "You're looking more like a real Tommy every day, Fletcher. Shopkeeper's gone. Soldier's what's left." Birdie wasn't sure if that was a compliment, but he understood what Parker meant. The civilian he'd been was slipping away, replaced by someone harder, more alert, more aware of how quickly life could end. Later that night, as he stood watch again, staring out into the darkness of no man's land, a strange calm settled over him. This was his life now. The mud, the danger, the discomfort. He would endure it because there was no alternative. He would do his duty because others depended on him. And maybe, just maybe, he would live to see Liverpool again. But in the meantime, there was the dawn stand to prepare for, and another day in the trenches ahead. 2 weeks into Birdie's time at the front, it rained for 5 straight days. Not the gentle drizzle he knew from Liverpool, but a relentless downpour that turned the trenches into flowing streams and the dugouts into damp caves. Williams said, wringing water from his sodden tunic, "Is when you find out if your trenches were dug right. Theirs weren't. The drainage channels overflowed within hours. The sump pits filled and refused to drain. Water rose steadily until they were wading ankle-deep, then calf-deep through the main trench. The firing step became unusable as mud sloughed off the walls, covering the wooden platforms. "Get those duckboards secured," Holloway shouted over the drumming of rain on helmets. "If they float away, we'll be standing in this muck for a week." The duckboards, wooden platforms laid on the trench floor to keep feet above the mud, were indeed starting to float, bobbing on the rising water like shabby rafts. Birdie and Cooper hammered stakes through them into the ground below. fighting a losing battle against the elements. Their dugout didn't fare much better. Water seeped through the timber roof despite the corrugated iron sheets the engineers had installed. It ran down the walls and pooled on the floor, soaking their blankets and equipment. Sleep became impossible. The best they could manage was a kind of damp doze, propped against walls or curled on the highest bunks. "Welcome to the real war," Parker told them with grim humour. "Not bullets or shells. Mud and water, that's what'll kill most of us." It wasn't just discomfort. Trench foot became a real concern, a fungal infection caused by constantly wet feet that could turn gangrenous if not treated. Every day, Lieutenant Wilkins ordered a foot inspection, having men remove boots and socks to check for early signs. "Fletcher, your feet are starting to look like a bloody fish," he said, examining Birdie's pale, wrinkled soles. "Dry them properly and put on clean socks." Easy to say, impossible to do when everything they owned was soaked through. The veterans had tricks, though. They taught Birdie to tuck spare socks inside his tunic, where body heat would keep them somewhat dry. They showed him how to rub feet with whale oil, issued specifically to prevent trench foot. "Do each other's feet," Parker advised. "Can't reach properly yourself, and it gets the blood flowing." So Birdie found himself sitting on an ammunition crate, rubbing whale oil into Williams's feet, while Williams told stories about the coal mine he'd worked in back home. "Thought that was bad. Working in water up to my knees," Williams said. "At least the mine was warm, and we got to go home after." Food during the deluge became a new challenge. The field kitchens were too far back to deliver hot meals in such conditions. They subsisted on cold bully beef and hard biscuits, supplemented by whatever they could heat over small spirit stoves, mostly tea, the universal British solution to all problems. The tea, at least, was hot, though it tasted of disinfectant from the water purification tablets they had to use. The bully beef was monotonous, a greasy, salty meat paste that came in tins and could be eaten cold or fried if you had the means. The hardtack biscuits were exactly as named, so hard they could chip teeth if you bit directly into them. "Trick is to put 'em in your tea," Cooper demonstrated, dunking a rock-hard biscuit into his steaming mug. "Let 'em soak till they're soft enough to eat without breaking your jaw. Even softened, they tasted like cardboard, but they filled the stomach. Hunger made even these rations palatable. The constant work of maintaining trenches in such conditions burned calories faster than they could replace them. The only bright spot in this miserable week was a care package that arrived for Birdie from his mother, somehow making its way through the chaotic supply lines despite the weather. It contained wool socks, a fruit cake that had survived surprisingly well, a bar of chocolate, and cigarettes, luxuries beyond price in the trenches. "Share that out, mate," Jenkins said, eyeing the cake hungrily. Birdie did, cutting it into careful portions with his bayonet. The familiar taste of home, raisins, cinnamon, butter, was almost overwhelming after weeks of army rations. He saved the chocolate, rationing it to himself one small piece each day, letting it melt slowly on his tongue while he stood watch. The cigarettes, too, became currency. Birdie didn't smoke much himself, but trading a cigarette could get your boots cleaned, your place in the ration queue improved, or a tip about when the next mail delivery was coming. Some men seemed to live for tobacco, their hands shaking until they got that first drag of the day. Steadies, the nerves, explained a man named Thompson, who'd traded Birdie 2 candles for a single cigarette. Can handle anything Fritz throws at us, long as I've got my smokes. The rain finally eased on the 6th day, though the damage was done. The trenches would take weeks to dry out completely. In some places, the walls had collapsed entirely, requiring full rebuilding. Everyone's feet were shriveled and pale from constant wetness, despite their best efforts. But the break in the weather allowed for some improvements. Hot food made its way up from the field kitchens, a stew of unidentifiable meat and vegetables that was nonetheless the most delicious thing Birdie had tasted in days. Fresh bread, too, though already turning stale by the time it reached them. The routine of trench life reasserted itself. Stand to at dawn, equipment check, morning hate, the ritual exchange of shell fire, as both sides tested each other's alertness. Then breakfast, followed by the day's assigned tasks. Today, Birdie was on latrine duty. Possibly the worst job in the trenches. The latrines were simply deep pits dug into the ground behind the support trenches, with wooden seats positioned over them. After use, each man was supposed to throw in dirt to help with the smell and deter flies. Few bothered. "Hold your breath and think of England," Holloway advised as he assigned the detail. It was solid advice. The stench was overwhelming, a combination of human waste, chloride of lime used as disinfectant, and the lingering smell of sickness from men with dysentery or other stomach ailments. Birdie's job was to ensure the latrine trenches were properly maintained, that lime was spread, and that the seats were at least marginally clean. It was disgusting work, but necessary. Disease could spread rapidly in the crowded conditions of the trenches. Dysentery, typhoid, trench fever, wool, all could sweep through a battalion faster than German bullets. "Rather be shot than die shitting myself to death," Williams commented cheerfully as he passed by on his way to the very facilities Birdie was maintaining. After latrine duty came a welcome change. Birdie was assigned as a runner, carrying messages between their company commander and battalion headquarters in the reserve trenches. It meant moving through the trench system, learning the layout of communication trenches, support lines, and reserve positions. The battalion headquarters was a revelation. 20 feet, a proper dugout. 20 feet underground, reinforced with heavy timbers, equipped with tables, chairs, even proper bunks for the officers. Maps covered one wall, showing their sector of the line in detail, with German positions marked based on intelligence reports and aerial photographs. Captain Mercer, their company commander, was delivering a report on trench conditions, standing stiffly before the battalion colonel. Grey-haired man with a magnificent moustache, who looked like he'd stepped out of a recruitment poster. "Flooding in sectors 3 and 4 has been addressed, sir. Though we lost 30 yards of firing position in Sector 3 when the parapet collapsed," Mercer was saying. Engineers estimate 3 days to rebuild properly. The colonel nodded, making notes. He glanced up, noticing Birdie waiting at attention. "Who's this?" "Runner from B Company, sir." Mercer explained. "One of the new drafts." The colonel studied Birdie for a moment. "How are you finding the trenches, son?" Birdie hesitated, unsure how honest he should be. "No need to sugarcoat it," the colonel said with a tired smile. "I've been in them too. Wet, sir. Very wet." The colonel actually laughed. Succinct and accurate. "You'll do well here." He turned back to Mercer. "Continue your report, Captain." Birdie stood silently, taking in the surroundings as the officers talked. A field telephone sat on the table, connecting headquarters to the artillery batteries behind the lines. Runners like him came and went, bringing messages from other companies, from observation posts, from supply officers. It was a glimpse of the machinery behind the war, the organization that kept them fed, armed, and pointed toward the enemy. When Mercer finished his report, he handed Birdie a sealed message to take back to Lieutenant Wilkins. The return trip through the communication trenches was quicker now that Birdie knew the route. He noticed things he'd missed before, the way certain sections were reinforced with different materials, how machine gun positions were sited to create overlapping fields of fire, the small signs that helped navigate the maze-like system. Back at their section of the line, he found most of the men engaged in stand down, the period of relative rest between morning duties and the evening stand to. Some slept, grabbing whatever rest they could on the fire step or in the cramped dugouts. Others wrote letters, played cards, or simply stared into space, conserving energy. Jenkins was writing a letter, using the back of a ration tin as a desk, his handwriting cramped and uneven on the rain-spotted paper. "To your girl?" Birdie asked, settling beside him after delivering the message to Wilkins. "Nah, don't have one," Jenkins replied. "To my mum. Tells me the neighbours keep asking how I am. Don't know what to say that won't get censored out." The military censors read all outgoing mail, blacking out anything that might reveal troop positions, casualties, or morale issues. It made honest communication difficult. Most men resorted to stock phrases. "I am well," "the food is good," "the weather is fine," regardless of the reality. "Tell her about the rats," Williams suggested, joining them with a mug of tea. "Censors don't care if you tell her Harold tried to steal your boot last night." Jenkins grinned. "She'd have a fit. Hates rats worse than Germans." "Smart woman," Williams said. "Germans'll kill you clean. At least, rats go for your eyes first." This cheery thought was interrupted by the arrival of the mail runner, bringing letters from home and, more importantly, copies of week-old newspapers. News was as valuable as cigarettes in the trenches. Information about the wider war, about what was happening back in Britain, about anything beyond their small section of mud. Birdie received another letter from his mother, full of the same cheerful domestic news and questions about his health. Reading between the lines, he could tell she was worried sick, but trying not to show it. His father had written too, a brief note mentioning that his old position at the department store had been filled by a woman. part of the new female workforce taking over men's jobs for the duration. The newspapers painted an optimistic picture of the war. Allied advances, German retreats, victory just around the corner. The men read these accounts with cynical amusement, comparing them to their own experiences. Says here we've got the Hun on the run. Cooper read aloud from the Daily Mail. Funny? They didn't seem to be running yesterday when they dropped those shells on D Company. It's all rot for the folks at home, Parker said dismissively. Can't tell 'em we're stuck in the same trenches we were in last year, making no progress. Bad for morale. Morale was a fragile thing in the trenches. It could be broken by something as simple as continuous rain, or sustained by small comforts like a dry pair of socks. The officers understood this, which was why the rum ration was so important, not just for its warming effect, but for the brief moment of normality it represented. The afternoon passed slowly. Birdie cleaned his rifle for the third time that day, removing mud that seemed to get into the mechanism no matter how carefully he protected it. The clear weather meant increased sniper activity. Everyone moved carefully, keeping heads below the parapet, using periscopes to observe no man's land. At 4 o'clock, orders came down for a wiring party that night. Birdie, Cooper, and 4 others were selected to go out after dark to repair the barbed wire entanglements in front of their position. It was dangerous work, out in the open, exposed to enemy fire if they were spotted, handling the vicious barbed wire that could tear flesh as easily as clothing. Parker told them, seeing their expressions. It's cloudy tonight. No moon. Fritz won't see you unless you're careless with noise. The hours until dusk passed with tense anticipation. At the evening stand to, everyone manned the fire step again, watching for any sign of enemy movement as the light faded. With full darkness, the wiring party gathered their equipment, spools of wire, stakes, gloves, and cutters. Lieutenant Wilkins gave them final instructions. Move slowly. No sudden movements. No talking once you're over the top. If a flare goes up, freeze immediately. Don't try to drop down. That movement is what gives you away. If you're hit, don't call out. The rest of the party will have to leave you until it's safe to recover you. Cheerful stuff. They went out through a narrow sally port. A gap in their own wire, just wide enough for a man to pass through. The darkness was near complete. The only light coming from occasional distant flares or the brief flash of guns. The ground beneath their feet was a nightmare of shell holes, broken equipment, and unidentifiable debris. Birdie's heart hammered so loudly he was sure the Germans must hear it across no man's land. Every step felt like an eternity, expecting at any moment to hear the crack of a rifle or the chatter of a machine gun. But they reached the forward wire without incident. Working by touch more than sight, they began repairing gaps in the barbed wire barrier, HE2, unspooling fresh wire, securing it to stakes, creating the tangled obstacle that would slow an enemy attack. It was painstaking work in the darkness, the barbs catching on clothing and skin despite their gloves. Halfway through the task, a flare shot up from the German lines, bathing everything in harsh white light. Birdie froze as instructed. Half crouched in an awkward position, wire cutters in his right hand. His shadow stretched long and dark across the broken ground. The flare seemed to hang forever, swaying gently on its parachute. He didn't breathe, didn't blink, became a statue amid the wasteland of no man's land. When the light finally died, they resumed their work with even greater caution. Another flare could mean they'd been spotted, but none came, and within an hour they had completed their repairs and were sliding back through the sally port into the relative safety of their own trenches. "Good job," Wilkins told them quietly. "Get some rest. You've earned it." Rest was easier said than done. The adrenaline of being out in no man's land left Birdie wired, unable to settle despite his exhaustion. He sat on the fire step, sharing a cigarette with Cooper. Neither of them speaking, just processing the near miss they'd experienced. "You never get used to it," Parker told them, joining them with his own cigarette glowing in the darkness. "The waiting, the fear, you just learn to live with it." The next few days settled into a rhythm. The weather improved, allowing the trenches to dry out somewhat. The regular duties continued. Stand to, inspections, maintenance work, sentry duty. German artillery fired daily, but seemed focused on other sections of the line. Their own guns replied, the shells whistling overhead on their way to unseen targets behind the German front. Food improved slightly with drier conditions. Hot meals arrived twice daily from the field kitchens, usually stew of some kind, with meat and vegetables cooked to a uniform mush, but hot and filling nonetheless. Bread was still in short supply, but the quartermaster somehow produced jam to spread on their hardtack biscuits, a luxury that made the cardboard taste almost palatable. The biggest improvement was the arrival of rubber waders, thigh-high boots that kept their feet dry even in the deepest mud. They were awkward to walk in and hot in the sunshine, but the relief of dry feet made these discomforts insignificant. "First time I've had warm feet in a month," Jenkins said, wiggling his toes in dry socks, after removing the waders. Even the wildlife seemed less oppressive as the trenches dried. The rats were still there, still boldly raiding food stores and running across sleeping men, but somehow less menacing in dry conditions. The lice remained a constant companion, but regular chatting sessions kept their numbers somewhat controlled. 3 weeks into their rotation, word came down that they would be relieved in 2 days. Another battalion would take over their section of the line, while they moved back to the reserve trenches for a week, then further back to a rest camp for 3 days before returning to the front. The news lifted everyone's spirits. The reserve trenches were still trenches, but farther from the Germans, less exposed to snipers and direct artillery fire, and the rest camp meant real beds, hot food, baths, and maybe even a visit to an estaminet, the French cafes that served beer and wine to soldiers on leave. "Don't get too excited," Holloway warned them. Rest camp just means more training, route marches, and kit inspections, without the excuse of enemy fire to give you a break. But even Holloway couldn't entirely hide his anticipation of hot baths and clean clothes. 3 weeks without proper washing had left everyone filthy and smelling like a combination of sweat, mud, and decay. The final 2 days in the line seemed to stretch endlessly. Everyone was more careful, knowing relief was coming, No one wanted to be the last casualty before moving to safety. Extra vigilance at stand to, extra caution when moving through exposed sections of trench. On their last evening, as the light faded and they prepared for the final stand to, Lieutenant Wilkins gathered them for a brief address. "You've done well," he said simply. "You came as recruits. You're soldiers now. Remember what you've learned here when we return to the line. It will keep you alive." High praise by British Army standards. Birdie felt an unexpected surge of pride despite the misery of the past weeks. They had endured. They had done their duty. They had become part of something larger than themselves. That night, as he stood his final watch in the front line, staring out across no man's land toward the invisible Germans, Birdie reflected on how much had changed. He had arrived terrified, overwhelmed by the conditions, the danger, the sensory assault of the trenches. Now, while still afraid, only a fool wouldn't be, he had found a kind of acceptance. This was his life now. These men were his brothers. This muddy ditch was his home, and in 2 days he would have a proper bath, a change of clothes, and maybe even a glass of French wine. Small comforts in a world gone mad, but enough to keep going. Enough to survive another day in the trenches of the Western Front. The relief came before dawn. Birdie stood on the fire step, rifle ready for the morning stand to, when he heard shuffling footsteps in the communication trench behind them. A line of dark figures appeared, the Durham Light Infantry, come to take their place. The handover was quick and subdued. No ceremony, just tired men showing other tired men the peculiarities of the trench section they'd called home for weeks, which parts flooded first in rain, where the German snipers focused their attention, how far their patrols usually ventured into no man's land. "Mind that section," Birdie told his replacement, pointing to a stretch of parapet. "Collapsed twice already. We reinforced it, but it won't hold in heavy rain." The Durham man nodded, his face half hidden by a scarf against the pre-dawn chill. "Thanks, mate." And just like that, they were done. Their platoon gathered their kit and filed into the communication trench, heading away from the front line for the first time in 3 weeks. No one spoke much. The relief of leaving was tempered by the knowledge they'd be back, and by a strange sense of abandoning their post, despite the proper relief. The light grew as they moved through the trench system. Following guides from the Durham Battalion, the familiar zigzag of front-line trenches gave way to the straighter communication trenches, then to the wider support trenches where they'd first arrived. By the time the sun properly rose, they were nearly 2 miles behind the front. The reserve line was a revelation. The trenches here were wider, deeper, and drier, with proper wooden revetments holding back the walls and solid duckboards covering the entire floor. Dugouts were more substantial. Some even had wooden doors and glass windows salvaged from ruined houses. Braziers burned openly, without fear of giving away positions to enemy observers. "Home sweet home," Holloway announced as they reached their assigned section. "Get settled, then clean yourselves and your kit. Just because we're in reserve doesn't mean standards drop." Their new accommodations were luxurious by trench standards. The dugout had proper bunks built into the walls, a table made from ammunition boxes, and a small stove that provided both heat and a place to warm rations. 6 men fit comfortably where they'd been crammed 10 in the front-line dugouts. "Christ, it's like the bloody Ritz," Williams said, dropping his pack on a bunk. They spent the morning cleaning themselves as much as possible with cold water from their canteens, then their rifles and equipment. Birdie stripped his SMLE down to components, removing weeks of accumulated grit and oil, then reassembled it with practiced hands. The ritual was soothing, returning order to at least this small part of his world. Midday brought another surprise. Hot food delivered from a proper field kitchen, with enough for second helpings. Stew again, but richer than they were used to, with chunks of real beef, potatoes that held their shape, and gravy thick enough to stand a spoon in. Fresh bread, too, still warm from the ovens. "This is how they keep you going back to the front," Parker explained through a mouthful of stew. "Remind you what civilization feels like, then send you back to the mud." After eating came the first real relief many of them had felt in weeks. Bathing, not full baths, but washing stations set up in a ruined barn, with water heated in large cauldrons over fires. Men stripped down in shifts, scrubbing weeks of trench grime from their bodies, while others kept watch for the inevitable artillery that targeted such rear areas. While they washed, their uniforms went to the divisional laundry and delousing station, a converted brewery where clothing was subjected to high-pressure steam that killed lice and their eggs. In the meantime, they were issued clean, if ill-fitting, replacements. "First time I've been properly clean since France," Jenkins marvelled, rubbing his pink, scrubbed skin. "Almost forgot what it felt like." The sensation of clean skin under clean clothes was disorienting after so long. Birdie kept running his fingers through his hair, marvelling at the absence of the constant itching from lice. He knew it wouldn't last. The parasites would find them again once they returned to the line, but for now, the relief was profound. With cleanliness came medical inspection. An RAMC doctor set up in another barn, checking each man for signs of trench foot, lice-borne diseases, or the early symptoms of shell shock. Birdie's turn came in late afternoon. "Boots and puttees off," the doctor instructed, a middle-aged man with bags under his eyes and a cigarette hanging from his lips. He examined Birdie's feet with brisk efficiency, probing between toes and pressing on the soles. "Early signs of trench foot here. Nothing serious yet, but you need to keep them dry. Got spare socks?" "2 pairs, sir." "Change them twice daily, more if they get wet. Rub with whale oil after washing, and let them air whenever possible." Simple advice that could save not just comfort, but limbs. Trench foot, if it progressed, could turn gangrenous, leading to amputation. Birdie had seen men carried out of the line with feet swollen purple and black, never to return. Next came a check for lice-borne illness, trench fever being the main concern. The doctor examined Birdie's body for the telltale rash, then checked his temperature and pulse. "Any fever? Headaches? Muscle pain?" "No, sir." "Good. Keep it that way." The doctor made a note on his clipboard. Next. The physical exam complete, Birdie expected to be dismissed. Instead, The doctor gestured to a chair. Sit. Few more questions. These were different, not about his body but his mind. Had he experienced moments of extreme fear, difficulty sleeping, periods of shaking or inability to control his movements? Did he have nightmares? Did loud noises cause him to dive for cover even in safe areas? The questions probed for signs of shell shock, what some doctors were now calling neurasthenia or war neurosis. Birdie answered honestly, yes to the nightmares and jumpiness at loud noises, no to the uncontrollable shaking or complete breakdowns some men experienced. The doctor nodded, unsurprised. Normal reactions? If they get worse, if you find yourself unable to function or control yourself, report to medical immediately. Don't try to hide it. That only makes it worse in the end. It was a surprisingly compassionate approach. Early in the war, shell shock had been treated as cowardice or malingering, sometimes punished rather than treated. Now, after millions of casualties, the army was beginning to recognize it as a genuine medical condition. Birdie had seen the victims, men who couldn't stop shaking, who screamed at the slightest sound, who stared into space unresponsive to any stimulus. A man in C Company had been carried out just last week, unable to speak, his eyes wide and unseeing after a particularly heavy bombardment. No one called him a coward. Evening brought another luxury: sleep without sentry duty. In the reserve trenches, fewer men were needed on watch, allowing longer stretches of unbroken rest. Birdie slept for 10 hours straight, the longest since leaving England. He woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where he was, reaching for his rifle before remembering they were behind the lines. The next day established a new routine. Morning inspection, breakfast, then training. Because the army never wasted an opportunity to drill men, even those just out of the front line, they practiced with Lewis guns, the light machine guns that provided crucial fire support in the trenches. They rehearsed bombing tactics with dummy Mills grenades. They studied maps of the trench systems, memorizing routes and strong points. "Pay attention," Holloway emphasized during the map exercise. "Knowing your way around could save your life if a barrage cuts off your section. Always have a secondary route in mind." The afternoon brought fatigues, the endless maintenance work that kept the army functioning. Birdie's platoon was assigned to the supply depot, unloading boxes of ammunition, rations, and equipment from lorries and organizing them for distribution to the front. Hard work, but different from the constant tension of the front line. Here, shells fell occasionally. The German guns regularly targeted rear areas to disrupt supplies, but the danger wasn't constant. Men worked without constantly looking over their shoulders or diving for cover at every sound. After 3 days in the reserve, trenches came the promised move to the rest camp, an actual village 5 miles behind the front, partly damaged by shell fire, but still largely intact. The men were billeted in houses, barns, and requisitioned buildings, sleeping on straw pallets on floors, but under actual roofs instead of earth and timber. Their platoon was assigned to a former schoolhouse, its classroom now a barracks for 30 men. The blackboard still hung on one wall, math equations half erased from what must have been the last lesson before evacuation. Children's drawings were tacked to another wall. It was a jarring reminder of the normal life that had existed before the war, and might someday exist again. The village offered simple pleasures that seemed miraculous after the trenches. A real bathhouse had been set up in the former town hall, with large metal tubs filled with hot water. Men were allocated 10 minutes each, barely enough to get properly clean, but heavenly nonetheless. There was even entertainment. A regimental band played in the village square one evening, brass instruments gleaming in the light of improvised lanterns. They played military marches, popular tunes from before the war, and songs that had become favourites among the troops. "It's a long way to Tipperary," "Pack up your troubles," "Keep the home fires burning." The estaminet lived up to expectations, too. It was just a farmhouse, with tables set up in the front room, and a harried French family serving weak beer and sour wine. But after weeks of water and tea, it tasted like nectar. The men were limited to 2 drinks each. Officers reasonably concerned about having a battalion of drunk soldiers to manage. To absent friends, Williams proposed a toast on their second night, raising his glass. They all knew who he meant: Johnson with his neat bullet hole, Thompson who'd disappeared in a shell burst, Jenkins' brother in another regiment, reported missing on the Somme. Absent friends, they echoed, solemn for a moment, before conversation resumed. The rest period brought mail that had accumulated while they were in the line. Birdie received a package from home, more socks, a fruit cake that had survived the journey surprisingly well, a newspaper from Liverpool, and letters from both parents. His mother wrote about neighbours and relatives, domestic details that seemed surreal compared to his current existence. His father's letter was different this time. Less practical advice, more questions about what Birdie had seen and done. Reading between the lines, Birdie sensed his father, a veteran of an earlier, smaller war, trying to understand his son's experience. How could he explain it? The constant fear, the moments of terror, the stretches of mind-numbing boredom, the smells that never left your nostrils, the sounds that woke you from sleep months later, the way you learned to tell from the sound alone whether a shell would land near or far, whether to dive for cover or keep eating your bully beef. Birdie wrote back, finding himself unable to convey the reality, but trying nonetheless. He described the physical conditions but not the fear. He mentioned comrades but not casualties. He touched on the routine but not the horror. The result felt dishonest. But what alternative was there? The truth was unspeakable, especially to those who waited anxiously at home on their third day in the rest camp. Birdie witnessed something unexpected. A football match between their company and a unit of Royal Engineers. An improvised pitch had been marked out in a field behind the village, with coats for goalposts. Men who had been trying to kill Germans a week earlier now chased a ball with boyish enthusiasm, cheered on by their comrades. "Didn't know you could play," Birdie commented to Cooper, who had scored 2 goals already. "Centre forward for my town team back home," Cooper replied, panting from exertion. "Was on trial with Bolton Wanderers before the war." These glimpses into pre-war lives fascinated Birdie. The banker who collected butterflies, the miner who played the violin, the farmer's son who could recite Shakespeare from memory. The war had thrown together men who might never have met in civilian life, creating unlikely bonds. Those bonds were strengthened through shared experiences, both terrible and mundane. The man who shared his last cigarette when yours ran out. The one who took your sentry shift when exhaustion overwhelmed you. The one who wrote letters for you when shrapnel left your right hand bandaged and useless. These were the threads that held men together in the face of industrialized slaughter. On their final evening before returning to the reserve trenches, Birdie sat outside the schoolhouse with Williams, Parker and Cooper, sharing a bottle of wine someone had acquired through mysterious means. The sky was clear, stars visible in a way they never were. In Liverpool's smog, artillery rumbled in the distance, a night bombardment somewhere up the line. Strange to think it's the same sky they're looking at back home, Cooper mused, passing the bottle. Same stars my girl can see from her window in Manchester. Not thinking about it is better, Parker said flatly. Home, I mean, drive yourself mad otherwise. Williams disagreed. Thinking about home's what keeps me going. The pit will still be there when this is over. My ma'll still be making the same bloody awful stew. Something's got to stay the same. Birdie understood both perspectives. Thoughts of home could be a lifeline, a reminder of what they were fighting for, what awaited them if they survived. But the contrast between that normal life and their current reality could also be painful. The gulf between them sometimes seeming unbridgeable. What about you, Fletcher? Cooper asked. Going back to selling ladies' hats when it's over. Birdie hadn't thought about it much. The future seemed a fragile thing, too uncertain to plan for in detail. Don't know. Can't imagine doing that now. Can't imagine doing this forever either. Parker nodded. War changes you. Can't go back to being who you were before. This simple truth hung between them as they passed the bottle. They were different men than those who had sailed from Southampton months ago. Harder in some ways, more fragile in others. They had seen things that had marked them permanently, formed bonds that would never fully be understood by those who hadn't shared the experience. The next morning came too soon. They formed up in the village square, kit packed, weapons cleaned, ready to march back toward the line. The brief respite was over. The short stretch of normalcy, of comfort, had to be set aside as they returned to the world of mud and blood and steel. As they marched out, Birdie looked back at the village. The schoolhouse, the estaminet, the bathhouse, simple things that had come to represent luxury. Ahead lay the reserve trenches again, then eventually the front line, the same cycle repeating, until what? Victory? Peace? Personal survival or death? The ending remained unwritten, but he had learned something important in these weeks of war. Survival wasn't just about physical endurance or luck. It was about finding reasons to continue, small comforts, moments of connection, brief respites that recharged the spirit for the challenges ahead. It was about the bonds formed with men who understood what no one else could, who would drag you to safety under fire or share their last biscuit when rations ran short. The battalion marched in step, rifles on shoulders, packs adjusted to distribute the weight as comfortably as possible. Their boots raised dust from the road, coating uniforms already fading from the original khaki to a nondescript battlefield grey. From a distance, they would look like any other unit, interchangeable parts in the vast war machine. But within that apparent uniformity existed individuals: Birdie with his shopkeeper's eye for detail, Williams with his miner's stoicism, Cooper with his footballer's quick reflexes, Parker with his veteran's hard-won wisdom, each carrying their own fears, hopes, and memories as they returned to the rhythms of trench warfare. The sounds of the front grew louder as they marched: the crump of artillery, the distant rattle of machine guns. The war waited for them, unchanged by their brief absence, ready to resume its terrible work, yet something had changed within them. A resilience forged through shared hardship, a determination born of survival against the odds. Birdie shifted his pack slightly, adjusted his grip on his rifle, and kept marching toward the sound of the guns. One step at a time, one day at a time, finding strength in the men who walked beside him. The shop clerk from Liverpool had become a soldier, had found within himself resources he never knew existed. Whatever came next, he would face it with these men, his unlikely brothers, in a world gone mad. Their return to the trenches followed the same route in reverse: reserve line first, then support trenches, and finally, after a week of relative safety, back to the front line. The stretch in reserve had been almost pleasant. Decent food, dry dugouts, occasional hot tea. Even the work details weren't too bad, mostly repairing roads and unloading supply trucks. But all good things end in war. "Home sweet home," Cooper muttered as they filed into the front-line trench that would be theirs for the next 3 weeks. It wasn't the same section they'd held before. They'd moved about half a mile north along the line. Birdie was surprised by his reaction to being back. A strange sense of familiarity washed over him. Not comfort exactly, but something close to it. The smells, the sounds, even the particular quality of fear, all recognized by his body before his mind could process them. "Getting that feeling again?" Parker asked, noticing Birdie's expression as they dropped their packs in a dugout. "What feeling? Like you've been here before, even when it's a different trench. They call it déjà vu." Birdie nodded. "Something like that." The new section was both better and worse than their previous position. Better in that it had been recently reinforced by engineers, with proper revetments holding back the walls and deeper dugouts cut into the rear face of the trench. Worse in that it was closer to the German line. In some places, no more than 50 yards separated them from the enemy. "Close enough to hear them talking sometimes," explained the corporal from the unit they were relieving. "They've got a bloke who speaks English, likes to shout insults around midnight. Gave us a start the first time." The proximity changed the nature of their daily existence. Snipers were a constant threat. Any head showing above the parapet, even for a moment, risked drawing fire. Movement during daylight was kept to an absolute minimum. Even the periscopes used to observe no man's land had to be raised with caution, as German marksmen targeted them specifically. Holloway gathered them after the relief was complete. their predecessors trudging back towards safety. Listen up. This is a hot section. Fritz is close enough to lob grenades if he gets ambitious. No unnecessary movement during daylight. No smoking at night unless you're in a dugout. They'll target the glow. And for God's sake, keep noise to a minimum at all times. The warning was driven home their first night, when a German patrol crept close enough to throw 3 grenades into the trench before being driven off by rifle fire. No one was killed, but a man from another platoon lost 2 fingers to shrapnel. They're testing us, Parker explained, as they reinforced the parapet the next morning, working in the relative safety of dawn mist. New unit in the line, they want to see how we respond. Take our measure. Birdie wondered what that response should be. He got his answer that evening, when Lieutenant Wilkins selected him and 5 others for a patrol of their own. Reconnaissance only, Wilkins emphasized as they checked weapons and blackened their faces with burnt cork. We're not looking for a fight, just need to map their wire, locate any weak points, and get a sense of their sentry patterns. Night patrols were among the most dreaded duties, out in no man's land, exposed to fire from both sides if something went wrong, crawling through mud and shell holes, past decomposing bodies and tangles of barbed wire. Birdie checked his rifle 3 times, made sure his bayonet was secure, and tucked an extra bandage in his pocket. Small rituals against the vast uncertainty ahead. They left the trench at midnight through a sap. A narrow trench extending out toward the German lines that provided some cover for the first few yards. Beyond that was no man's land proper, a hellscape of shell craters, broken equipment, and the unburied dead. Moving silently in the darkness, they crawled from crater to crater, using the broken ground for cover. The night was overcast, giving them good concealment, but making navigation more difficult. Wilkins led, compass in hand, occasionally checking landmarks noted on the trench maps. No man's land had its own unique smell, a combination of churned earth, explosive residue, stagnant water, and decay. The ground was never dry, ranging from merely damp to actual standing water in the deeper shell holes. Birdie's uniform was soaked through at the knees and elbows within minutes. Halfway across, they froze at a sound from the darkness ahead. Voices speaking German, the glow of a cigarette briefly visible. A German patrol, also out in the lethal space between trenches. By unspoken agreement, both groups pretended not to notice each other, changing course slightly to avoid direct contact. The war had rules of its own, not all of them official. They reached the German wire 10 minutes later, thicker and better maintained than their own, with knife rests and chevaux de frise, creating a formidable barrier. Beyond it, they could make out the German parapet, the occasional shadow of a sentry moving against the slightly lighter sky. Wilkins sketched the layout in a small notebook, marking points where the wire seemed thinner or damaged by artillery. They spent 20 minutes observing, noting the timing of sentry changes, the position of a machine gun post, the location of what appeared to be a small sally port for the Germans' own patrols. Their return journey was more tense. Crossing back into British lines carried its own dangers. as nervous sentries sometimes fired at anything moving in no man's land. They used the agreed-upon password of the night, Waterloo, as they approached their own wire, still crawling to present the smallest possible target. The relief of dropping back into their trench was overwhelming. Birdie's hand shook as he accepted a mug of tea laced with rum, his body coming down from the heightened alertness of the patrol. "Well done," Wilkins told them quietly. "Good information. Could be useful if battalion decides to raid their line." The thought of crossing that deadly space again, this time with the intention of entering the German trench, was something Birdie pushed aside for the moment. One nighttime excursion was enough, for now. Days passed, blending together in the familiar rhythm of trench life. Stand to at dawn and dusk, maintenance work during daylight, ration parties and work details at night. The Germans shelled them regularly, but not heavily, probing fire rather than a serious attempt to destroy their position. Their own artillery replied in kind. British 18-pounders behind the lines fired over their heads, shells whistling as they passed on their way to the German trenches. The sound became so familiar that Birdie could distinguish between different calibers just by the noise they made passing overhead. "That's a 4.5-inch, he said one morning as a particularly loud screech announced a shell's journey. "Getting to be a regular artilleryman, aren't you?" Cooper laughed. "Next you'll be telling us where it'll land." "Somewhere over there." Birdie gestured vaguely toward the German lines. "Where there's Germans." "Well, that narrows it down." The banter was part of their survival strategy. Humour in the face of absurdity, jokes to mask fear. It created a sense of normalcy in circumstances that were anything but normal. Men who couldn't find this release often broke down faster than those who could laugh at their situation, however darkly. 2 weeks into their rotation came the rain again, a steady downpour that turned the trench bottoms to liquid mud despite the duckboards. The parapet began to slump in places as the earth grew sodden. Dugouts leaked, leaving them with no truly dry place to rest. "I'm starting to grow webbed feet," Williams complained, squelching through ankle-deep water on his way to the latrine trench. "Might be an improvement, actually." The rain brought another misery, rats seeking higher, drier ground. They invaded the dugouts in greater numbers, bold enough to run across sleeping men and steal food from pockets. One particularly large specimen became infamous for snatching an entire tin of bully beef from the company sergeant major's pack, earning the nickname Kaiser for its audacity. "If we could train them to cross to the German trenches, we'd win the war," Jenkins suggested, throwing a boot at a rat that had paused to stare at him with surprising insolence. Despite the discomfort, the routine continued. Shells fell, rations arrived, letters came and went. Men stood watch, cleaned weapons, repaired damaged sections of trench. The war machine ground on, uncaring about the condition of its smallest components. One clear night, with stars visible between scattered clouds, Birdie had a moment of unexpected beauty. On sentry duty at 3 a.m, he watched a shooting star trace a bright line across the sky, above no man's land. For a breath, the war seemed to recede, the cosmos asserting its vastness against the temporary insanity of men killing each other over a few yards of mud. The moment passed when a German machine gun opened up further down the line, the staccato rattle a harsh return to reality. But something of that brief peace stayed with Birdie. A reminder that the world was larger than this narrow strip of devastation. In their third week, they received orders for a trench raid, a quick strike into the German lines to gather intelligence, take prisoners if possible, and generally keep the enemy unsettled. Lieutenant Wilkins selected 20 men, including Birdie, Williams, and Cooper, for the operation. Based on your patrol observations, he explained, indicating a rough map of the German trench, we'll enter here, where their wire is thinnest. 2 groups, first to secure the entry point, second to penetrate 50 yards along their front line. 5 minutes maximum, then withdraw. Questions? There were none, or at least none that would make a difference. Raids were risky but routine, part of the constant probing and testing that characterized trench warfare. Success was measured not in ground gained, which would immediately be abandoned, but in information gathered and casualties inflicted. Preparation was meticulous. They blackened their faces and hands with burnt cork to reduce visibility in the darkness. They taped equipment to prevent rattling. Rifles were left behind in favour of trench clubs, knives, and pistols, quieter weapons for close-quarter fighting. The raid was scheduled for 2 a.m., late enough for German alertness to fade, but early enough to complete the operation and return before dawn. As they waited in the sap trench, ready to move into no man's land, Birdie felt a strange calm descend. Fear was still present, but distant somehow, observable rather than overwhelming. "Ready?" Williams whispered beside him. Birdie nodded. Words seemed unnecessary, even intrusive in the moment. The signal came. 3 taps on a canteen, barely audible but distinct to those listening for it. They moved out in single file, dropping to hands and knees once beyond the sap, then to their bellies. As they approached the German wire, their path had been carefully plotted to avoid known German listening posts and sentry positions. They crossed the shattered landscape in silence, each man focusing on the dark shape of the soldier ahead, maintaining spacing and direction. The German wire loomed before them, twisted strands with barbs that could tear flesh as easily as cloth. Wire cutters made short work of the outer strands, creating a narrow passage just wide enough for a man to crawl through. Birdie felt the sharp points tugging at his uniform as he wriggled past, holding his breath at each metallic creak. Beyond the wire lay a shallow ditch, then the German parapet. They could hear voices now. Quiet conversation in a language none of them understood, but recognized as the enemy's. 2 sentries, from the sound of it, perhaps 10 yards apart. Wilkins gave the signal. The first group surged up and over the parapet, swift and silent. There was a brief scuffle, a choked cry quickly cut off, the dull thud of a trench club finding its target, then stillness, and the hand signal to advance. Birdie was in the second group, tasked with moving along the German trench to gather intelligence on their defences and take a prisoner if possible. The German trench was surprisingly similar to their own, the same timber revetments, the same duckboards, the same small comforts improvised by men living in impossible conditions. They encountered a German soldier emerging from a dugout, perhaps responding to some sixth sense that danger was near. Williams tackled him before he could raise an alarm, clamping a hand over his mouth while Cooper secured his arms. The man's eyes were wide with terror in the darkness. Another German appeared, shouting in alarm before Birdie could reach him. Instantly, the raid's silent phase ended. Flares shot up, bathing the trench in harsh white light. Machine guns began to chatter, firing blindly, but creating a wall of lead that would make their exit far more dangerous. "Fall back!" Wilkins ordered. "Now!" They retreated the way they had come, dragging their prisoner with them. The German fought like a wild animal, requiring 2 men to control him. Birdie found himself at the rear of the withdrawal, covering their escape with a German pistol he had seized during the brief fighting. The journey back across no man's land was a nightmare of flares, machine gun fire, and the crash of grenades. They crawled from shell hole to shell hole, using the broken ground for cover. A man ahead of Birdie was hit, crying out before falling silent. 2 others grabbed him, dragging his limp form toward their own lines. When they finally tumbled back into their trench, the count was grim. 2 dead, 3 wounded, 1 missing. Against that, 1 prisoner captured, a section of German trench mapped, and a few documents seized from the body of a German officer killed in the brief fighting. The battalion commander considered it a success. The men were less certain. "Worth it?" Cooper asked as they cleaned the mud and blood from their equipment afterward. Birdie had no answer. The calculus of war, I see, lives expended for information gained, was beyond his understanding. He only knew that he had survived when others hadn't, a fact that brought relief tinged with a guilt he couldn't fully articulate. The German prisoner was taken to the rear for interrogation. Birdie sometimes wondered what information he provided, whether it justified the lives spent to capture him. He never found out. 3 days after the raid came their relief, another battalion arriving to take their place in the line. The handover was as subdued as their own arrival had been, with tired men briefing other tired men on the peculiarities of this stretch of mud and timber that temporary ownership had made them experts on. Jerry machine gun at the far end has a habit of firing at 22 minutes past the hour. Birdie told his replacement, a fresh-faced boy who looked like he should still be in school. "Don't ask me why, but you could set your watch by it." The boy nodded, trying to look like this made sense to him. Birdie felt a sudden urge to tell him more. Important things, life-saving things, but there was too much, and time was short, and some lessons couldn't be taught, only lived. They filed out through the communication trench as night fell, heading back toward the reserve line and eventually another rest period. No one spoke much. Relief at leaving the front was tempered by the knowledge they would return, the same cycle repeating until it didn't. Birdie found himself walking beside Holloway, the sergeant unusually contemplative in the gathering darkness. "You've changed." Holloway said after they'd gone some distance. "Sir, when you first came out, you were newer, cleaner." Holloway seemed to be searching for words, "Not just your uniform. Inside." Birdie considered this. "Suppose we all were. Some more than others. You were selling women's hats, what, 6 months ago?" "8, sir." Holloway nodded. 8 months. Lifetime, really. They walked in silence for a while, the sounds of the front receding behind them. The communication trench wound back through shattered farmland, past ruined buildings that had once been homes, fields that had once grown crops. "Does it get easier?" Birdie finally asked. "The going back, I mean." Holloway took his time answering. "Not easier, more familiar. There's a difference." Birdie thought he understood. The fear never left, but it changed form. The raw terror of his first days had been replaced by something more constant, more manageable, a companion rather than a master. He had learned to function despite it, to find moments of peace amid chaos, to build a life of sorts within the narrow boundaries of trench existence. As they marched, the sky cleared, revealing a half-moon that cast silver light across the broken landscape. In that gentle illumination, Birdie could see the men around him, Williams with his miner's stoicism, Cooper with his footballer's grace, Jenkins with his perpetual worry, Parker with his veteran's patience. Ordinary men in an extraordinary situation, finding reserves of courage and endurance they never knew they possessed. The shopkeeper from Liverpool had become a soldier, not by choice initially, perhaps, but by necessity, and then by a kind of acceptance. The uniform that had once felt like a costume now seemed like skin. The rifle that had once been awkward was now an extension of his arm. The fear that had once paralyzed now merely informed. They reached the reserve trenches near midnight, filing into the comparative comfort of deeper dugouts and wider passages. Hot tea waited for them, and the promise of actual bread with breakfast, small luxuries that now seemed like extravagance. Birdie found a spot in a dugout, arranging his pack as a pillow. The sounds of men settling for the night surrounded him, quiet conversations, the rustle of blankets, occasional coughs. Nearby, someone was softly humming a tune from home. As sleep approached, Birdie's thoughts drifted to Liverpool, to the department store where he'd worked, to his parents' small house with its tiny garden, to the ordinary life he'd left behind. It seemed impossibly distant now, belonging to another person in another world. Yet it remained, waiting for his return if he survived. Would he go back to selling hats? Could he, after this? The question had no immediate answer. For now, there was only the next rotation, the next stint in the line, the next challenge to be faced. The war stretched ahead, its end not yet visible. 1917 would bring new offensives, new technologies, new horrors. The Americans would eventually join, tipping the balance, but on this night, in late 1916, all that remained uncertain, the future a dark landscape as broken and treacherous as no man's land. What was certain was the present moment, the thin blanket providing modest warmth, the solid earth beneath him instead of liquid mud, the presence of comrades who understood what no one else could. Small comforts, but real ones. Birdie Fletcher, once a shop clerk and now a soldier, closed his eyes and let exhaustion carry him towards sleep. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Tonight he had survived. In the trenches of the Western Front, that was victory enough. As you lie there, warm and safe in your own bed, think of those men in the mud of France and Belgium, finding sleep where they could, when they could. The trenches are long gone now, grassed over and peaceful, but the courage of those who endured them remains. Let their resilience ease you towards